So, what I think is interesting about Terry Leahy is he's no sandal-wearing hippie, this guy. He's a very, very tough businessman and successful businessman, voted every year by his peers as the most admired businessman in the UK. And he regularly now stands up and talks about climate change and says, this issue matters to me and I care, as do 25 of our main business leaders. And it's been a really important and powerful change to such an extent that our business leaders are now calling on our government to say, let's have some more leadership on this issue, please, because they want a sense of direction and leadership from government. So I want to turn next and look a little bit about what government and the consumer are doing. So where are government and consumers? Well, let's see where you think your government is. So I want you to put your hand up if you think your government is showing adequate leadership on climate change. Not one. Golly. I'd give my government probably a slightly higher score than that. I think our government are doing some good things on climate change. We've been particularly good in the international negotiations. So our government perhaps this is part of our history, going around and telling the rest of the world what they ought to be doing. But we're quite good at that, and we've really been working quite hard to get a deal in Copenhagen. And we've been excellent at setting targets. Okay, we've got targets for everything. And this culminated last year. We did a world first, which we passed a climate change bill. So a Climate Change Act. So basically, in law in the UK, we have to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050, and there's milestones on the way to reaching that. And then different sectors and government departments have their bit to play in meeting that. So very, very strong on rhetoric, very, very strong on targets. Where we're not quite so good, perhaps, is taking that back to what's actually changed on the ground. And when I look around in the UK, I still don't get the sense of, despite all the big talk, that we're in any sense moving in the kind of scale and pace that we need to hit those kind of those targets of decarbonising the entire economy in a single generation. So it'd be good to talk a little bit in the questions about what more we need to see from government. For me in the UK, it's certainly a couple of things if we're going to get this innovation unleashed that we need to see. And the first is to think about how they do regulation. And we work a lot with those businesses. And in the UK, regulation is often civil servants double-guessing how business should do things best and making laws around it and punishing for very small infringements. And I'd like to see a lot more regulation that says, this is the big goal that we want to get to, zero-emission cars or zero-carbon housing or whatever. That's the target. We're going to meet it by this date in 10 years' time. Then you, industry, universities, innovators, creative people, go away and sort out how to get there, because government doesn't know how to do that, but people who run businesses, who want to make money, who invent things do. So a different kind of regulation that allows innovation I'd like to see much more of. And the other thing I think that we're going to have to see to drive this low-carbon innovation is a proper price for carbon in the economy, which we're still a long way away from. We have an emissions trading scheme in Europe, but it's imperfect, and the price of carbon is moving around, and we need to see a high and consistent price of carbon that sends the signal through business, through industry, that actually this is something we need to price properly and therefore innovate to use less of. So what about the consumer? Well, let me ask the same question of you about the consumer. On balance, do you think they've got this issue here in Australia? Who thinks on balance consumers are on top of the issue? Not a single person again. I would say in the UK, again, it's probably a bit more positive than that. There is awareness, growing awareness amongst consumers, and we've had a very strong movement in the last 10 years around labelling, fair trade and organic and marine stewardship and forest certified and so on, that has helped to raise that awareness. But when it comes down to it, they're still not, consumers and citizens still aren't there in the UK either. And the way I like to characterise our consumers and our citizens is like this, that they're green in the abstract, and anti-green in the particular. Okay? So what I mean by that is if you go and ask them, do you care about climate change, do you want to save the planet? They all say yes, yes, yes. When you say, okay then, will you drive less, change your behavior, possibly sacrifice some of your freedom, they all say no, no, no. So we're kind of a bit of a conundrum where they're kind of saying they want it, but then when you ask them whether they actually do, the behaviors aren't changing. And we did some work with that supermarket Tesco to think about, well, what is it that consumers want and need? And we kind of teased out from this research that the consumers are confused, okay? And they're confused because they're getting so many different messages about what to do and what's right. And we in the Green Movement are partly to blame in that, too much squabbling amongst ourselves. They haven't got the clear paths and sets of actions that they know that they need to take and paths that they need to follow. And they're mistrustful because lots of ordinary consumers say that they think this green thing is a conspiracy to make them pay more for stuff. Okay? So particularly low-income consumers think it's a conspiracy. Lots of low-income countries around the world also think it's a conspiracy to stop them developing. So we researched with Tesco about what to do with consumers, and we kind of came up with 3 things that they really wanted in this agenda. And that was the product should be cheap, easy, and guaranteed to make a difference. Okay? Cheap, easy, guaranteed to make a difference. So cheap, you go particularly to low-income consumers, they're not expecting to pay any more for this stuff. Okay? They're largely saying that should be taken care of now. It should be an integral part of how people do business, and it should just be sorted out for us in the product. So they don't want to be paying a whole lot more for green stuff. Easy, they said they don't want to have a master's in life cycle assessment to work out which product to buy or how to track it down. Okay, so easy choices put in front of them. And guaranteed to make a difference, they didn't want greenwash, and they wanted to know that if they bought this product, something actually would be better and would change. So as part of the consumer agenda we're trying to work with Tesco's is on that cheap, easy, and guaranteed to make a difference. And those consumers also said to us very, very clearly that they didn't want it to be an agenda about punishment and telling them off. Okay? They wanted it to be an agenda that was more positive and rewarding. And that takes me into the final section of my talk, when I want to talk about how we frame and discuss these issues. So if we're going to get consumers on board with these changes that we need, we're going to get companies pointed in the right direction, we're going to unleash all that innovation that we need, I think we need to think and ask ourselves questions about how we're framing the agenda for people. Now, all of us need stories about the future and about where we're going. And that's true of you as individuals, for people in companies, indeed for whole countries. We need a sense of what our destination is and what we're aiming for. But if you think about the environmentalists, the green story about the future, what comes to mind? What's our story of the future tend to be about? It's overwhelmingly a story about doom and gloom and apocalypse and the Earth's dying and it's all going to be terrible and you're going to lead awful lives and it's all going to be horrible. And guess what? Most ordinary people don't like that. Okay? It switches them off, it paralyzes them into fear and inactivity. And, you know, as a psychologist, it's pretty clear to me that our society is not going to vote wholesale for a big project of change in which people think they're going to be worse off. Okay? It's just not going to happen. Okay? So we've got a real conundrum here as environmentalists, because partly we need to tell some of those stories, as I did earlier, about what's happening to the Earth and the pressure on our resources and the crisis and the negativity. We need some of that to get people to listen. But if we give too much of it, then it actually stops people listening and stops us moving forward on the agenda. So I think one of our big challenges in how we frame this agenda is to get a better balance between that negativity and fear and that positive and inspirational stuff. And I like to use the example that Martin Luther King, he didn't stand up and make a speech that said, "I have a nightmare." But, you know, but that's what we as Greens tend to do every day. So in terms of framing, how are we going to frame these issues in more positive and more inspiring way, so that for individual consumers, they think that their life is going to be more secure, more prosperous, happier. For companies like those ones that I showed you and that we work with, they think they're going to be more successful and make more money by doing business in different ways. I think we've got a job to think about how we frame this issue in a more positive way. So I want to conclude now, and just to kind of reinforce a couple of things that I said to you. So firstly, I set out the scale of that challenge, that we're living as if we've got 5 planets, or 3 planets now, 5 planets by mid-century. We need to live as if we've got 1. Secondly, that the only way through that conundrum, I think, is by innovating, to find ways to do these things with a fraction of the resources and a fraction of the pollution. So we're just much, much smarter about how we deliver for everybody's wants and needs. That there are lots of businesses already out there, and some of the biggest, baddest businesses in the world starting to change and do things differently and make money out of this new agenda. And also that we need to start to frame this issue in different and more positive ways. So I just want to close by leaving you with a thought. And it's this. I think that our generation, this generation that's living from 3 to 6 to 9 billion people, we have an incredible responsibility. Okay? An incredible responsibility, perhaps even the most important generation in human history. We have responsibility because we know the score. Okay? We know what's happening. Climate science is very clear. We know that if we continue on this trajectory, what's going to happen. So we have that incredible responsibility, but it's also an important generation because we're the last generation, I think, that probably has the opportunity to change that, to move the course, to innovate, to change the trajectory. So my leaving thought for you is I want us to be that generation that accepts that responsibility, seizes those opportunities, and there are loads of opportunities, and makes the change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter Madden, the CEO of the Forum for the Future in the United Kingdom. We have a couple of roving microphones, so you need to put your hand up if you'd like to make a contribution, so we can get a microphone to you so you can be recorded. So, yes, we have someone just up here. If you can get a microphone across there, please.
Ian Blair, I'm a sustainability consultant. One of the big things that I think I'd like you to comment is how do you get people working rather than having to wait for an election to get some movement. The transition town which started in the UK seems to have a message, but it would seem to me that if we use something that's growing rapidly like the internet to have a roadmap and all the facts there that can guide each of us, that we can take an informed movement. Have you got any suggestions?
Mm-hmm. It's a big question. Again, how do we move everybody quickly enough? And there isn't an easy answer, otherwise we would be doing it. Okay, but let's try and think about some components of an answer. I've worked now in government, and I've worked in the voluntary sector, and I've worked with all these businesses. And in each of them, I found that nobody was moving because they felt like other people wouldn't let them. Okay, so I was in government, and I'd say, let's be braver, and they say, well, we can't because there'll be protests and we'll get voted out. Go to businesses and say, let's be brave, and they say, oh, we can't because the consumers won't let us, and go to consumers and they say, well, there's no leadership from government and business aren't providing the opportunities. So one of the things that we were trying to do at Forum for the Future is to say, how can we line up those major groups in society so that that vicious circle becomes a virtuous circle and they start to free each other up and enable each other to make those choices. And you can get that lining up happening at a very local level. And transition towns, which did come out of the southwest of England where I live, doing a fantastic job at mobilising at a very local level. And we're trying to do some of that mobilising at a national level with those organisations. So you need to line all of those people up. I guess my worry is that we're not going to see the step change that we need, and I think that you're suggesting we need, without something more. And for me, in the end, that comes down to leadership. And what's quite interesting, that I've tried to identify there in the UK, is that I think that we're seeing more leadership at the moment from our business community, and particularly from our major retailers, than we are even from our voluntary sector and NGOs and from our government. So find the leadership. And those companies mostly are doing what they're doing, partly out of profit, but mostly because those senior business people have looked at the science and understood the science, and that it's irrefutable, really, I think, in their eyes, and they just feel it's now their responsibility to show leadership and do something differently. And I think a lot of it is going to come down to the science and how we handle it. And there's been a lot of kind of deliberately muddying the science and kind of raising questions and difficulties about it. Pretty much all those senior business people in the UK that now have been exposed to that science are on that journey to change.
We had another question in the middle there. That gentleman with his hand
up. What dollar value do you think we need to put on carbon to achieve a 90% reduction?
Well, it's a really good question, and it's probably going to have to be quite high, but clearly society can't cope with it being that high immediately. Okay, one of the problems with pricing energy is that if you're a wealthy person, your energy use actually is quite a small part of your outgoings and your budget. If you're a poor person, and particularly in a cold country like ours, it's a relatively big part. So if you push up energy prices too quickly without taking any of the countermeasures, then it's a kind of socially unequal, regressive set of policies. So we do need to increase energy prices, but we need to do it gradually. We need to do it in ways that we're making sure that those parts of the economy and society that need it have the help. And then in terms of pricing, I mean, I think some of the pricing will start to sort itself out as, oil resources and decline and global demand for oil goes up. The price is going to increase, and people will start to become more efficient. But I would say that, I would be wanting to see prices of, around 100 Australian dollars a tonne for carbon to see it priced properly.
Okay, another question. Yeah.
Sue O'Connor, I'm a board member on Goulburn Valley Water. Just like to make a comment and then ask a question. If you look at the way that Australia has responded to its scarcity of water, we've had a reduction in between 60 to 80% in water usage by consumers and industrial companies because there was no choice. And we have a situation that as our water frees up when we get rain or other alternative sources, that there is not that commensurate increase in the usage. I think it's an example of that people felt that there was no other choice. And what I am struggling and noodling at the moment is that I think people still think there is a choice. With using coal-fired, gas-powered stations and so on. And I'm just wondering, I don't have the answer to it, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are to have that sense that there is there is no choice, we have to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, the really positive message in what you say is that people can change, and there's a kind of real example of that social change can happen when people are confronted with things. The problem with climate change is by the time people are confronted by the real and the worst impacts of climate change, it will be too late, because we'll put too much carbon up there to do much to reduce the impact. So, I mean, going back to the science, one of the things that we're working quite hard about is how do you bring that future into the present and show people actually both the negative side of if we don't act, what will that future look like, and then back to my framing, also the positive benefits of if we do, how is your country going to be more prosperous and secure in the world, how is your company going to be more profitable, and how is your life going to be better as an individual. It is difficult, though, because we're not very good as human beings in kind of thinking that far forward and about impacts that might hit. We're not very good at taking decisions for next week and next year, let alone 30 or 40 years. So, I guess for me, it comes back to finding ways to raise people's understanding of the science and the impacts and what it's going to mean if we don't act, and then the benefits. And actually, I think it's perhaps different for you in Australia, given the basis of your economy, but for our economy in the UK, there's all sorts of very positive and obvious spin-offs and benefits from making those changes.
Okay, gentleman here. Yep.
Just want to follow up that point. We seem to have a couple of some mixed messages. So when we're talking about a low-carbon economy, generally in a public sense, we're talking about our power generation utilities. In the examples that you've given us today, we're talking about companies who are re-engineering their processes so that in the end they use less carbon. So the discussion is not so much about how we generate our energy, but how we're saving our energy. And in people's minds, when they're coming to terms with the low-carbon economy, they're not separating out the two things. And so one is, in a way, empowering us, because we can actually see how we can re-engineer a process to provide a saving. The other is disempowering us, because in terms of changing our power generation processes, in Australia we burn so much coal or whatever. The problem is too large, and it's so large we can't get hold of it. So one we can do something about and we can see it, and the other just seems too big.
Yeah. Well, you pointed out exactly the issue around energy generation and energy use, and for a long time it was the same in the UK that policymakers, politicians obsessed with generation, with how we produce energy and the big kit and so on, and completely ignored energy efficiency, which actually is where a lot of the big and quick wins are to be made, as you found out with water. People save money, and as soon as you start to get the economic models right and you get business thinking about this, huge benefits, which mean you then have to generate much less. Then, when it comes to the generation side, it's then thinking about what's the energy mix and what's it going to look like. And we've got a battle going on in the UK, which I'm sure you'll have a similar battle here about. It's basically around big versus small. Okay, and again, the policymakers, senior civil servants I deal with, they kind of cling to this need that we should have a national grid, and we'll have these big power stations, and only ours will now be nuclear is their plan rather than coal and gas, and we'll have half a dozen of these big things that will power the whole country, versus a lot more of the kind of green view that says, actually, we need the stuff to be distributed and local and smart, and to take the lesson of the internet that, it's not about a couple of supercomputers that power the whole world. It's actually about distributed intelligence that talks to each other in a much more interesting way. So we're kind of having that battle, and it's not clear to me yet in the UK who's going to win, whether it's going to be the kind of resilient, small-scale, distributed local stuff or the big kit. I guess in the end, whichever path you go down, it's going to have to be green and clean.
Yes.
You spoke quite a lot about the differences between business and government, and I guess you've shown that there's a very easy message to sell to businesses in terms of profit motive and in terms of appealing to relatively, powerful individuals within businesses or individuals that run businesses who have a capacity to make quick changes. I wonder if you could comment a bit on how you sell the message to government, which is risk-averse and often doesn't have such a streamlined decision-making process.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've worked in my government at the highest levels, and what's what's clear is that government is risk averse. I mean, the kind of targets that some of these big companies that we're working with are setting, they're saying, we don't even know how we're going to meet them, but we're smart people, we'll get there. It's impossible to do in government. And when I was working in our government, our Treasury would never let us set a target that we didn't know on current knowledge how we'd meet every single percentage point of it. So where's the room for innovation and change in that? So partly that's got to be thinking about how do you change government and bring different ways of thinking and different people in. What government does do quite well, I think, is evidence-based policy making. And in the UK, we're obsessed by that. So they are good at looking at evidence. So compiling and marshalling your evidence in the right way is also important. And then most importantly of all, I guess, is that, governments have a market to sell to, just the way businesses do, and it's their electorate. Okay? So governments are only going to go so far ahead of where their electorate is. And if they go too far ahead, then they get a bloody nose, and all the other politicians get scared and they learn a lesson and they kind of step back again. So I think for a long time in the UK, there was an overemphasis in going and lobbying government. And everyone thought, if we lobby government, it will change. People belatedly have started to realise, people like Transitions Town and lots of the more grassrooty campaigns, actually, we need to change the electorate at the same time in order to change government.
Yes.
Really, on that theme, you've talked a lot about the optimistic promise of innovation to meet our current needs, but there is a side that you didn't talk much about, and that is our levels of consumption. And we live in a Western world where there's a group delusion that the more stuff you've got, the happier you are. And this is profoundly untrue. In fact, by voluntarily simplifying our lives, we can improve the quality of life. So how do you see that message of voluntary simplicity, less consumption, vis-a-vis the things you've talked about?
Okay, so you're completely right, and I just didn't have time to cover everything in my talk. As well as kind of being smarter about how we produce things, we need to change what people's wants and desires and perceived needs are, I think. But I guess the challenge there is then how do you help people make those changes? Because if we kind of get people to think that it's sacrifice or rationing, which is kind of some of the language that we sometimes use, then it's very difficult for people to buy into that. So people have to somehow think that it's the better, or know that it's the better choice that they're making, that they are going to be happier, better off. People are going to admire them more and be more popular and successful by doing that stuff. And so how do we get there? And I guess there's a bit of a conundrum, a bit of a challenge that we face of, do we do that by commercialising those choices even more and getting those smart brands to be selling people just different stuff that's experience and knowledge and lifestyle stuff, or do we sort of try and take it out of the economy entirely? I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect that we're only going to get to people buying into the changes and the simplicity and so on by somehow making it the most desirable and fashionable way to live our lives. And only when we're doing that in the developed world can we have any hope and expectation that people in developing countries are going to follow us and do the same. Because at the moment they look at us and they say, you're telling us not to burn the coal and to develop in a low-carbon way, but you've chopped down all your trees and built all your buildings and had all your success. So I guess we've got to be finding ways to live that example if we want other people to follow.
With that, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I'd like you to join with me in thanking Peter Madden.